In the waning years of the 1930s, when the world's oceans trembled beneath the prow of rising empires, Japan's naval engineers began to dream of a weapon unlike any seen before. Across the gray, restless Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy sought not only dominance upon the surface, but mastery of the unseen depths below, a hidden arm of vengeance capable of striking anywhere, any time. The conception of the I-400 was not born from whimsy or curiosity. It was forged in fear, ambition, and the tightening noose of geopolitics. Tokyo's naval high command, haunted by the specter of American industrial might, knew that the island nation could never match the United States ship for ship. Japan's lifeblood was its ocean routes, its arteries stretched thin across the Pacific, and so it imagined a weapon that could reach the enemy's own shores, inflict chaos, and vanish beneath the waves before retribution could follow. The first seed of the I-400 plan took root in 1941, as Japan's war planners met in hushed rooms lined with maps that reached from the Aleutians to the Panama Canal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was among those who saw far beyond the horizon. He had glimpsed America's vast coastline, its sprawling naval bases, its unassailable distance. To challenge such power, Japan would need something asymmetric, something audacious. Yamamoto envisioned a fleet of underwater aircraft carriers, leviathans that could sail halfway around the world, surface silently under the cover of dawn, launch squadrons of bombers against cities and canals, and then sink once more into the ocean's black embrace. In the dry docks of Kure and Sasebo, draftsmen began sketching the impossible. A submarine longer than any the world had ever seen, more a submersible aircraft carrier than a hunter of ships. It would be over 120 meters from bow to stern, its pressure hull double-layered to endure the ocean's crushing weight, and within its vast belly would lie a cylindrical hangar, large enough to house 3 attack aircraft, each folded like a bird at rest. Above, a 140-foot catapult would stretch across the deck, a runway to launch death into the sky. The aircraft chosen for this mission of shadows was the Aichi M6A1 Seiran, Mountain Haze. Designed in secrecy, it was an aircraft of contradictions, a floatplane that could dive like a bomber, yet compact enough to be hidden within a steel shell beneath the sea. When folded, its wings hugged its fuselage with surgical precision, its tail rotated alongside, its floats detachable. Within minutes of surfacing, the crew could roll 3 Seirans out of their pressurized womb, attach floats, fuel, and arm them, and send them hurtling into the dawn with a single catapult stroke. From the beginning, this was a project soaked in paradox. Japan's engineers, many of whom doubted it could even function, worked under orders that tolerated no skepticism. Steel, manpower, and fuel, all desperately needed for the nation's defense, were diverted into this secret fleet. The submarines were to be built under extreme secrecy. Few within the Navy even knew of their existence. Workers at the Kure Naval Arsenal whispered of massive shadows beneath tarpaulin covers, of hull sections longer than destroyers being lowered into dry docks at night. In the years when Japan's war fortunes began to fade, the I-400s were conceived not as instruments of victory, but as weapons of desperation. They were the final gamble of an empire facing the storm. Even as American bombers began to darken the skies above Tokyo, construction continued. Each rivet, each length of pipe, each valve installed in the submarine's enormous bellies carried the weight of a collapsing dream. The idea that such vessels could exist seemed beyond the realm of the possible. No other nation had attempted to combine the air and the abyss in such a union. To create a submarine capable of carrying 3 aircraft required sacrifices of weight, balance, and structure that pushed the limits of metallurgy and design. But Japanese engineers, driven by duty and the illusion of divine mission, accomplished it. By 1943, the first hull, the I-400 herself, began to take shape. It was during those long nights in Kure that the shipbuilders began to refer to the I-400 as Sensuikan Tokugata, special type submarine. She was to be more than a vessel. She was a manifestation of Yamamoto's audacity, a floating shrine to technological hubris. Her range would exceed that of any submarine afloat, enough to encircle the globe 1.5 times without refueling. She carried 4 diesel engines generating 7,700 horsepower, driving her at speeds up to 18.7 knots on the surface. Below the waves, she moved more slowly, but with a silence that made her ghost-like. Inside, cramped passageways coiled between fuel tanks and ammunition lockers. The hangar dominated her central spine, sealed by a massive watertight door that could resist the pressure of 100 meters below the surface. Her crew quarters were tight and hot, filled with the oily smell of machinery and human endurance. Men slept in shifts, sweating beneath red emergency lights, dreaming of land they might never see again. Above them, officers plotted missions that even in their conception bordered on madness. The first plan was nothing less than the bombing of the Panama Canal. By striking the locks at Gatun, the Japanese hoped to drain the canal and cripple the flow of American warships between the Atlantic and Pacific. The attack would come from the east, from the unguarded side, where no one believed a Japanese submarine could appear. The I-400s would cross the Pacific, round Cape Horn, and approach the Caribbean, a voyage of 25,000 kilometers, through storms and enemy patrols, all to deliver a few bombs from 3 hidden aircraft. Yet as the war's tides turned faster than any admiral's calculations, the plan shifted. The canal attack was postponed, then abandoned. New orders arose. Strike at the American fleet anchored at Ulithi Atoll, a massive floating city of warships, carriers, and transports. It would be a blow of symbolism more than strategy, a final declaration that Japan, though bleeding, could still reach out and wound. By the time the I-400 and her sister ships, the I-401, I-402, and the unfinished I-403 and I-404, neared completion, the empire they had been built to defend was already dying. Yamamoto was dead, shot down over Bougainville. The seas once ruled by the rising sun were now patrolled by American hunter-killer groups, radar-equipped destroyers, and carrier task forces whose reach stretched to every corner of the Pacific. But in the silent depths beneath the turmoil, the I-400s prepared. Crews drilled in secrecy, learning to assemble the Seiran bombers in under 15 minutes, to fuel them, arm them, and launch them in synchronized rhythm. The submarines themselves were shrouded in myth, even within the Imperial Navy. Few believed such monsters truly existed. Those who had seen their outlines under construction described them as whales of steel, as if Japan had built its own Leviathan to challenge the gods of war. And so the dream of the I-400 took shape, vast, desperate, magnificent, and doomed. Beneath the rising sun, painted on their conning towers, they awaited the orders that would send them across the world. Above them, Japan's cities burned, its fleets shattered, its skies filled with fire. Yet in the darkness of the sea, the empire's most secret weapon was ready to surface. The ocean, vast and patient, would be their only witness. By 1943, Japan's naval engineers had moved beyond the blueprints of ambition into the raw forge of steel and sweat. The I-400-class submarines were no longer ideas whispered in corridors or outlined on drawing boards. They were titans rising from the scaffolds of Kure, Sasebo, and Hiroshima Bay, the hidden crucibles of a dying empire's last vision of supremacy. At Kure Naval Arsenal, beneath the clanging symphony of hammers and rivet guns, laborers worked day and night beneath blackout curtains. The war had already turned against Japan. Allied submarines prowled the home waters, and American bombers were beginning to appear even over the sacred homeland. Yet within this tension of collapse, the construction of the world's largest submarines advanced with an almost religious fervor. The workers did not see themselves as mere fabricators. They were craftsmen of secrecy, building a weapon so audacious that even the whisper of its name could summon suspicion. Each I-400 class vessel was designed to be more than a machine. It was a floating empire within itself. The complexity of their double-hulled design defied every precedent. Two massive pressure hulls ran side by side, joined by cross-members that distributed the immense stresses of the deep. Above them sat the cavernous cylindrical hangar, a feature so vast it distorted the vessel's balance and buoyancy. The engineers compensated with innovative ballast systems, intricate arrays of compressed air tanks and flood valves that could equalize the shifting weight of both sea and steel. Every meter of the submarine carried the fingerprints of innovation. The conning tower, unlike that of any contemporary submarine, was offset to port to make room for the 31-meter-long aircraft hangar that ran along the starboard side. Atop this metallic spine lay the catapult, a pneumatic launcher capable of hurling a fully armed Aichi M6A1 Seiran into the sky within seconds. Beneath the deck, compartments were crammed with the machinery of propulsion. 4 massive diesel engines built by the Mitsubishi Corporation, each a roaring furnace of iron and oil that could drive the vessel across 37,000 nautical miles, enough to circle the globe without refueling. Inside, the ship's innards pulsed with claustrophobic life. Crew compartments were narrow and labyrinthine, filled with the hum of air compressors, the rattle of valves, and the sharp tang of lubricant. Each submarine carried over 140 men, pilots, engineers, mechanics, torpedo specialists, and officers, a miniature fleet bound within one hull. The heat was constant, oppressive, and laced with the reek of sweat and diesel. Men learned to sleep beside turning shafts, to eat in the shadows of ammunition lockers, to memorize the breathing rhythm of the submarine herself. The I-400 was the first to rise from this industrial womb. Her hull sections were welded and lowered into the water with ceremonial reverence, though no banners were raised and no crowds gathered. Secrecy cloaked every movement. The launch took place under heavy guard. Even naval personnel outside the project were forbidden to approach the dock. The christening words were whispered rather than shouted, a quiet acknowledgment of both pride and fear. For this was no ordinary ship. It was the embodiment of Japan's refusal to yield. Testing such a colossus was an ordeal that stretched the limits of human courage and mechanical reliability. When the I-400 first submerged, engineers listened to the hull groan like a living creature under pressure. The steel flexed, rivets creaked, and the gauges trembled under the deepening weight of the Pacific. At 100 meters, silence enveloped the vessel, the kind of silence that feels like eternity waiting to collapse. Then, as the depth stabilized, the crew exhaled in unison. The impossible had become real. Her first surface trials were no less dramatic. The submarine moved through the inland sea with a sluggish majesty, her wake spreading like a scar across the morning waters. Observers on escort craft could scarcely believe her scale. She dwarfed the submarines of the old fleet, her conning tower towering like a building above the waves. To those who saw her for the first time, the I-400 seemed almost unreal, a warship conjured from the fever dreams of engineers. The aircraft that would crown this achievement, the Seiran, underwent its own journey of invention and sacrifice. Designed by Aichi's engineer Norio Ozaki, under the direction of Commander Mitsuo Matsumura, the M6A1 was unlike any other floatplane conceived. Its fuselage was sleek, its wings folding backward like the fins of a fish, and its engine, the Aichi Atsuta, a licensed derivative of the German Daimler-Benz, gave it the heart of a predator. Each aircraft could carry an 800-kilogram bomb or a torpedo, and its pilot was trained not merely to strike, but to die, if necessary. In hidden airfields, far from Allied reconnaissance, pilots trained to launch from wooden mock-ups of submarine decks. They practiced assembling and folding the aircraft until the movements became ritual. Within 7 minutes, 3 Seirans could be rolled out, unfolded, fueled, and launched. The crews repeated this exercise under the shroud of night, under simulated attack, under the glare of officers who reminded them that the weapon they served was not built for victory, but for glory. As testing continued, the I-400 sisters began to take form. The I-401 and I-402 emerged next from the same shadowed docks, each carrying refinements learned from the first vessel's trials. The I-402 was eventually converted to serve as a tanker submarine intended to ferry precious aviation fuel to Japan's isolated outposts, a grim reminder that by the time she was launched, the Empire's dreams of conquest had already given way to desperation. The Imperial Navy's engineers took pride in the technical marvel they had wrought. Yet even as they perfected the mechanisms of flight launch and underwater navigation, Japan's strategic situation deteriorated beyond repair. The once mighty combined fleet was a ghost of itself. Oil was scarce, steel scarcer still. The I-400 class submarines were, in truth, the last expression of a vanished confidence. Technological giants birthed into a world that no longer had room for them. Still, the command pressed on. Naval High Command envisioned a fleet of 18 of these underwater carriers, enough to strike simultaneously across the Pacific. Only 3 would ever sail. The others remained skeletal frames on dry docks when the bombs fell over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even in their infancy, the I-400s were haunted by the contradictions of their creation. Their vast size made them slower to dive, easier to detect on sonar, and harder to maneuver. Their complexity demanded more maintenance than Japan's shattered supply lines could provide, and yet, when they operated, they inspired awe. American intelligence would not even believe reports of such submarines until after the war's end. In the spring of 1945, the I-400 and I-401 were declared operational, their hangars sealed, their Seiran aircraft loaded, their crews trained to the edge of endurance. The trials had ended. The time of the undersea giants had begun. The Empire had no fuel, no carriers, and few cities left untouched, but it still had faith in the unseen, in the power of secrecy, in the shadow that moves beneath the surface of the world. And so the I-400s, those steel ghosts of ambition, prepared to depart the home waters, to sail into the dying light of the Pacific War, bearing within them the last whisper of Yamamoto's dream. By the early months of 1945, Japan's empire was a map of ruins. Its islands burned beneath waves of American fire, its navy lay in shambles at the bottom of the Pacific, and its air force was bled dry by the relentless sky. Yet deep beneath the surface, in the silence of the sea, something extraordinary still stirred. 2 vessels, the I-400 and I-401, waited in secret harbors, their steel hearts beating in defiance of inevitability. They were the ghosts of a dream long past, the last underwater carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, designed to strike the enemy where he felt untouchable. Their mission had shifted many times, from the audacious attack on the Panama Canal to a final act of symbolic vengeance. Now, in the closing stages of the war, they were assigned to a plan that bordered on myth: Operation Arashi, the assault on Ulithi Atoll. Ulithi, a tranquil ring of coral and turquoise in the Caroline Islands, had become one of the largest naval anchorages in the world. It was the beating heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, a floating city of carriers, battleships, and supply vessels. To strike it was to strike the center of American power in the Pacific, a blow that might shake morale, if not alter the course of war. In March 1945, the crews of the I-400 and I-401 assembled at the Ominato Naval Base under tight secrecy. Orders came from the highest echelons of what remained of the combined fleet. The submarines were to load their Aichi M6A1 Seiran aircraft, each equipped for a one-way bombing mission. The pilots, young men hardened by loss and indoctrination, accepted their fate without question. Their target, the vast anchorage at Ulithi, where the U.S. carrier Enterprise, the legendary Big E, was believed to be moored. The operations planning was meticulous and desperate. Each submarine would carry 3 Seiran bombers, launched just before dawn to minimize detection. The aircraft would approach Ulithi at wave-top height, drop their bombs upon the anchored carriers, and, if possible, crash into secondary targets, their return unnecessary. The mission would not win the war, but it would prove that Japan could still reach across the Pacific and strike the enemy's heart. Before departure, the submarines underwent final modifications. Camouflage paint darkened their hulls, radio silence was imposed, and all unnecessary equipment was stripped to reduce noise. The crews received injections against tropical disease and were issued rations for a voyage that could last months. Each man carried a vial of poison, the unspoken insurance against capture. On April 5, 1945, under a moonless sky, the I-400 and I-401 slipped from their moorings and began their journey into the unknown. They sailed through the waters of the inland sea, past the shadows of bombed harbors and the silent hulks of sunken ships. Japan was dying above them, but below the waves, the Empire's last heartbeat pulsed on. The voyage was long and perilous. American aircraft and destroyers prowled the Pacific in constant search of remaining Japanese submarines. The I-400s maintained radio silence, diving by day and surfacing only at night to recharge their batteries. The ocean became both ally and enemy, a vast mirror that hid them but could betray them at any moment. Inside the steel labyrinth, life settled into a rhythm of tension and ritual. The crew awoke to the clatter of the diesel engines and the sharp commands of officers. Meals were small, hot water scarce, and air heavy with the mingled scent of oil, salt, and humanity. Yet amid the claustrophobia there was pride. These men served aboard the most advanced submarines on Earth, vessels born of the Emperor's final vision. The pilots of the Seiran aircraft trained within the narrow confines of the hangar, rehearsing assembly drills under red light, their movements timed to perfection. Each repetition brought them closer to the moment when they would climb into the cockpits and vanish into the sunrise. As the weeks passed, the submarines crossed the equator and entered enemy waters. They were alone now, no escorts, no allies, only the deep. American patrols were thick across the Pacific, but the I-400s moved with the patience of predators, diving when aircraft were sighted, surfacing only when the radar screens showed nothing but the soft hiss of the sea. In late July, after months of travel, the submarines reached their forward base at Truk Lagoon, now a graveyard of Japan's former glory. Once the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Truk was a shattered skeleton of coral and rusting hulls, its once proud anchorage now ruled by silence and ghosts. The submarines anchored beneath the ruins of their own history, their decks washed by the same waters that had swallowed Japan's might. There, the final preparations for Operation Arashi began. The crews were briefed in secret. Maps of Ulithi were unrolled on mess tables, target photographs examined under dim light. The pilots studied wind patterns, approach routes, and bomb release points. They wrote farewell letters to families they would never see again. On the conning tower, a banner bearing the rising sun fluttered briefly before being taken down. Even the symbol of the nation was now too dangerous to display. The plan called for a simultaneous attack. The I-400 and I-401 would surface 500 miles east of Ulithi, launch their 6 Seiran bombers, then dive immediately to escape detection. The aircraft would fly low, under radar, strike at dawn, and vanish. It was a mission that required perfect timing and absolute faith. Faith in machinery, in the ocean's concealment, and in the sacrifice of men. But fate, ever cruel to those who tempt it, had already shifted. As the submarines prepared for their final run, news reached them of devastation unimaginable. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima vanished in a pillar of light. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Japan's command structure fell into chaos. Orders were delayed, signals garbled, and messages lost in the storm of surrender that followed. The I-400s received contradictory transmissions, some ordering them to proceed with the attack, others to return home. Within their steel walls, confusion spread like fever. Were they to strike, even now, when their homeland burned? Or was the war already over? Admiral Tatsunosuke Ariizumi, commanding officer of the I-401 and one of the most determined men in the Imperial Navy, hesitated only briefly. He had once served under Yamamoto himself and believed that Japan's honor demanded action. Yet even he could sense the futility. The ocean seemed to grow heavier, pressing down with the weight of defeat. At last, new orders arrived, clear and final. Cease all operations. Return to Japan. Prepare to surrender. The submarines turned north, their mission unfulfilled, their weapons unused. The Seiran aircraft, once symbols of daring and ingenuity, were brought up to the deck under a dim dawn. The pilots stood silently as the crew disassembled the planes, stripped their instruments, and pushed the remains into the sea. The Pacific accepted them without a sound. When the submarines surfaced days later, American aircraft were already circling above. Their radar had finally caught what was once considered impossible. The greatest secret of Japan's Navy had been found. On August 28, 1945, the I-400 and I-401 surrendered to U.S. forces at sea. Their flags were struck, their crews lined up on deck, their faces unreadable. The Americans who boarded them stared in astonishment at the scale and sophistication of the machines. They had expected relics of a defeated empire. Instead, they found marvels of engineering that even their own navy had never imagined. Operation Arashi had dissolved into history, a ghost mission swallowed by the tides of surrender. Yet the submarines remained as silent witnesses to an empire's final dream, a dream of power that reached beyond logic, beyond possibility, into the realm of myth. The I-400s had crossed the Pacific to strike an enemy that would never see them coming, and in doing so they had traveled not into battle, but into legend. The end came not with an explosion or a battle, but with silence. In the late summer of 1945, when the Pacific's storms had subsided and the ocean seemed weary from war, the great underwater carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy surfaced into surrender. The I-400 and her sister, the I-401, rose through the swells like beasts emerging from myth, their steel flanks scarred by months at sea, their decks heavy with rust and exhaustion. They flew no flag. The rising sun had been lowered, the emperor's voice had reached every corner of the empire, and Japan's warriors, once sworn to die before surrender, now stood beneath foreign skies with their hands open and empty. The war was over, though the ocean, indifferent to human ruin, rolled on as it always had. When the American task group sighted the two enormous silhouettes breaking the surface east of Honshu, disbelief rippled through the fleet. Reports had trickled in of Japanese submarines of unusual size, but none had imagined this. Vessels longer than destroyers, their conning towers towering like cliffs. The destroyer USS Blue approached cautiously, guns trained, signal flags snapping in the wind. The Japanese crews stood in formation along their decks, motionless, disciplined, the salt wind tugging at their faded uniforms. Aboard the I-401, Captain Tatsunosuke Ariizumi maintained his composure to the end. He had once commanded surface raiders, served under Yamamoto, and embodied the code of the warrior. Yet the realization of total defeat had hollowed him. Shortly before the American boarding party arrived, Ariizumi retired to his cabin, drew his sidearm, and took his own life. His men, bound by loyalty, wrapped his body in the imperial flag and committed him to the sea. The Pacific received him as it had so many, silently, indifferently. The Americans who boarded the I-400 and I-401 stepped into another world. Inside the narrow corridors, the air was thick with the smell of diesel and brine. Gauges flickered dimly on panels inscribed with kanji. The steel walls were coated in condensation, the deck plates slick underfoot. But what struck them most was the vast cylindrical hangar that ran the length of the ship, an impossible structure like the lung of some mechanical leviathan. Within it, they found tools, aircraft components, and spare parts for the Aichi Seiran bombers, machines designed to fly from beneath the sea. To the Americans, this discovery was staggering. The concept of a submarine aircraft carrier had been discussed in theory, but never realized at this scale. Here, in the aftermath of defeat, they found proof that Japan had built something far beyond expectation, a weapon that, had it been used earlier, might have changed the rhythm of the war's opening months. The captured submarines were escorted to Sasebo under American control. Along the way, sailors from both sides stood watch together, silent partners in an uneasy truce. The Japanese crews obeyed orders without hesitation, their discipline unbroken even in captivity. Some smiled faintly at their captors, others kept their eyes on the horizon. For many, the journey to Sasebo was not just the end of the war, it was the end of everything they had believed in. When the submarines entered the harbor, Allied officers, engineers, and intelligence experts were waiting. They crowded the docks, craning their necks to see the monstrous silhouettes glide into view. For a moment, even in defeat, the I-400 and I-401 inspired awe. Their hulls gleamed in the pale light, streaked with rust and memory. They were no longer weapons, they were enigmas. Inside, American naval intelligence teams began their work. The operation was codenamed Project Road's End. Engineers from the U.S. Navy and representatives from the newly established Office of Naval Research meticulously documented every valve, every switch, every design feature. The hangar doors, the folding aircraft wings, the pneumatic catapult, all were measured, photographed, and studied. Each discovery deepened the sense of wonder and unease. The aircraft themselves, the Seirans, were even more astonishing. A handful survived intact within the hangars, their wings folded seamlessly against their fuselages, their tails rotated for compact storage, their engines gleaming under layers of protective oil. The Americans reassembled one for testing, noting the precision of its design, its aerodynamic grace, its simplicity of function. These were not crude weapons of desperation. They were masterpieces of engineering, and they had been intended for suicide missions. The paradox haunted the observers. The same nation that had produced such delicate craftsmanship had also embraced destruction as a creed. The Seiran was a perfect embodiment of that contradiction, beauty made for oblivion. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, word of the capture spread quickly. Admirals, engineers, and strategists debated the implications. Could such a concept be adapted for American use? What had Japan intended to accomplish with these monsters? And, perhaps most importantly, could the Soviets, Japan's recent enemies, learn from them too? The answers, as with the ocean itself, were obscured by depth. For months after the surrender, the I-400 and I-401 remained under American control. Their Japanese crews, now prisoners of peace, were interrogated politely, their logs translated, their memories catalogued. They spoke without bitterness, describing the Panama Canal plan, the Ulithi mission, and the secrecy that had surrounded their construction. They spoke of Admiral Yamamoto's dream, of their endless drills, of nights when the sea felt like both home and grave. Yet time was running out. The Allied occupation forces in Japan were not alone. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan in August 1945, was demanding access to captured technology. In Moscow, naval intelligence officers pressed for details of the I-400s, claiming the right to examine them as part of post-war reparations. The Americans, unwilling to share their discovery, made a decision that would seal the fate of the undersea giants. In May 1946, orders came down quietly from the highest levels. The I-400 class submarines would be destroyed. Officially, it was for reasons of cost and logistics. Unofficially, it was to prevent the Soviets from seeing what the United States had already seen. The knowledge would be buried beneath the same ocean that had once hidden the submarines themselves. At Sasebo, the crews of the U.S. Navy's submarine division prepared the vessels for their final voyage. The I-400 and I-401 were stripped of sensitive equipment, their hangars emptied, their documents archived. On the morning of May 31, 1946, they were towed out into the Pacific, escorted by the submarine USS Trumpetfish. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so, a fitting stage for a silent farewell. Out beyond the coast of Goto Islands, at a site designated Point Deep 6, the hatches of the I-400 and I-401 were opened, demolition charges set. As the countdown began, the American officers watched from the decks of their escort vessels. There was no ceremony, no salute, no witnesses beyond the wind and the water. At the appointed moment, explosions rippled through the hulls. The great submarines shuddered, tilted, and began their slow descent. Water poured over the conning towers, rushing through the open hatches, swallowing steel and memory alike. Within minutes, the ocean closed over them. The waves rolled on, erasing the last traces of Yamamoto's dream. For decades, the I-400s lay forgotten beneath hundreds of meters of Pacific silence. Only whispers remained, rumors among veterans, fragments in classified archives, hints in the pages of history that such giants had once existed. But history, like the sea, never forgets forever. For half a century, the I-400 class submarines slept in darkness. The Pacific, vast and impenetrable, became their tomb and their guardian. Above them, generations lived and died, empires rose and fell, technologies surpassed even the wildest dreams of their designers. The war that had created them became history, its relics scattered across museums, its survivors dwindling to a few gray-haired men with distant eyes. Yet, beneath 600 meters of black water, the leviathans of Japan's last vision endured in perfect silence. The coordinates of their graves were known to few, Point Deep 6 had been marked on secret American charts and then quietly erased from most records. For decades, only a handful of naval historians even suspected where the I-400s had gone. The Cold War drew the attention of nations skyward and inland to missiles, satellites, and ideologies. The sea, timeless and patient, kept its secret. It was not until the dawn of the 21st century that curiosity began to stir again. The ocean had become a new frontier, not of conquest, but of remembrance. Oceanographers, divers, and historians began searching the depths for the lost machinery of the 20th century. Among them were teams from the University of Hawaii's Undersea Research Laboratory, SHU-RL, equipped with submersibles capable of reaching the dark zones where sunlight dies. In the spring of 2005, one of Hurl's vessels, the Pisces 4, launched from the research ship Kaimikai o Kanaloa into the waters off Oahu. The mission was routine, to map the seafloor and explore anomalies recorded by sonar. At first, the images were unremarkable. The ghostly contours of ridges and slopes, the skeletal remains of small wrecks. Then, at 700 meters, the sonar returned a shape that no one could explain. Long, cylindrical, immense, and unmistakably artificial. As the submersible descended, its lights cut through the abyss, revealing a sight from another century. Out of the darkness emerged a curved steel hull, over 100 meters long, encrusted with coral and silt. The conning tower rose like a monolith, still bearing faint traces of Japanese characters. Along its starboard side, a massive tube, the hangar, protruded, sealed in rust and mystery. The pilot stared through the viewport, awestruck. There, lying on the seabed like a sleeping god, was the I-401. The discovery sent ripples across the world. Naval historians and engineers gathered to analyze the images. The submarine was astonishingly intact. Even the outlines of its aircraft catapult were visible. Decades of pressure and corrosion had softened its edges, but its shape was unmistakable, the last of the underwater carriers, preserved in eternal stillness. Subsequent dives revealed more. The wreck rested upright on the ocean floor, its hull breached in places by the charges that had sunk it. The hangar door remained closed, the mechanisms frozen in time. Fish drifted in and out of the openings like curious spirits. The emblem of the rising sun was long gone, yet the ship's presence radiated a strange solemnity, neither triumph nor defeat, but endurance. Months later, researchers located another giant resting in the same abyssal region, the I-400 herself. She too lay almost intact, her hull bent slightly from the impact with the seabed, her catapult jutting into the sand like a relic of forgotten ambition. The discovery of both submarines, within reach of modern cameras, reawakened global fascination with a story that had nearly vanished. Documentarians, historians, and descendants of the original crews began piecing together the fragments of history. Old blueprints were unearthed from Japanese archives, photographs resurfaced from U.S. Navy intelligence reports. Survivors, few and frail, were interviewed, their memories trembling but clear. They spoke of secrecy, of drills in darkness, of the pride they had once felt to serve aboard the Empire's most advanced warships. Some wept when shown the images of the wrecks, seeing once more the vessels that had carried their youth into the deep. The rediscovery of the I-400s was more than an archaeological triumph. It was a moment of reckoning. In their rusting hulls lay a paradox that had defined the 20th century, humanity's boundless ingenuity harnessed for its own destruction. The submarines were relics of a vision that combined art and annihilation, precision and despair. They were proof that even as a nation collapsed under fire, it could still dream in steel and salt water. Scientists who studied the wrecks described them with reverence. The craftsmanship, even after decades underwater, was evident in the seamless welds, the clever folding mechanisms, the intricate control panels. "This was not a desperate improvisation," one engineer remarked. "It was the pinnacle of what they could build." The I-400s, in their quiet decay, testified to the brilliance and futility of human ambition. As the images spread across the world, Japan itself reflected on the meaning of the discovery. Newspapers ran features titled "The Empire's Lost Submarines Found" and "The Ghost Fleet Beneath the Pacific." In museums, scale models of the I-400s were displayed beside stories of their crews, young men who had trained for a mission that history had erased. For many Japanese, the rediscovery was a reminder not of glory, but of sorrow, the kind that lingers when genius is turned toward destruction. In the United States, naval historians compared the I-400s to the later nuclear missile submarines that patrolled the oceans during the Cold War. In a strange, almost poetic symmetry, Yamamoto's dream of an undersea platform capable of global reach had been realized decades later, though not in the way he imagined. The line between ambition and prophecy had blurred beneath the waves. In 2013, further dives with advanced remotely operated vehicles brought back high-definition images of the wrecks. The I-401's conning tower appeared ghostly, but proud, its periscope still rising like a frozen spear. The hangar's outer door, torn and gaping, revealed the empty chamber where the Seirans once rested. Inside, sediment drifted like snow. The interior controls, though corroded, were still recognizable. Gauges marked with Japanese characters, levers frozen mid-motion, the echo of a vanished human presence. The discoveries reignited discussions about preservation. Some argued that the wrecks should be left untouched, memorials to all who had perished in that ocean. Others dreamed of raising them, restoring at least one to display the marvel of its engineering. Yet the sea, indifferent and immense, had already claimed them. The cost, both financial and symbolic, was too high. The I-400s would remain where they were, monuments of iron and silence. In Japan, a few surviving crew members made pilgrimages to the coast near where the submarines had last sailed. They stood by the sea, now calm, now forgiving, and bowed toward the horizon. Some carried small wooden tablets inscribed with the names of their lost comrades. They spoke softly, not to the waves, but to the memory beneath them. For the world, the resurrection of the I-400s offered more than history. It revealed the persistence of memory, the way the sea preserves what time tries to erase. Beneath kilometers of pressure, in a place where light never reaches, the dreams and follies of humanity endure. The I-400s remain there still, their steel bones settling deeper into the sediment, their shadows merging with the currents. They are no longer weapons nor even wrecks, but witnesses. They remind us that technology, however brilliant, is only as wise as the hands that wield it. In the dim light of the submersible cameras, the Japanese characters on the control panels glint faintly, like whispers from another age. The ocean moves gently through the broken hatches, carrying the slow pulse of eternity. And somewhere in that darkness, the last echo of Admiral Yamamoto's impossible dream drifts between the currents, the dream of wings beneath the sea. When the century turned and the last veterans faded into silence, the story of the I-400s shifted from classified history to legend. They no longer belonged only to Japan or to the navies that had hunted and hidden them. They belonged to the collective imagination of a planet that had survived its own madness. The image of a submarine launching aircraft from beneath the waves became a symbol, not of victory, but of the perilous brilliance of human invention. In museums, models of the I-400 stand today in glass cases, their folded Seiran bombers poised like origami cranes of steel. Visitors peer at them with a mixture of awe and unease. The plaques speak of innovation, of courage, of tragedy. Children trace the outlines of the catapult with their fingers, unaware that it once hurled pilots toward death. For the curators who tell their story, the challenge is always balance, to honor the ingenuity without romanticizing the cause it served. In Japan's naval archives, the blueprints of the I-400s are preserved under soft light. The ink has faded, but the precision of the lines endures, a testament to minds that sought perfection, even in desperation. Historians study them not only for their technical daring, but for what they reveal about the psychology of an empire at its breaking point. The I-400s were machines built to transcend limitation, and in doing so, they exposed the limits of the civilization that conceived them. Their legacy reaches far beyond the war that birthed them. The concept of a vessel that could strike unseen from anywhere on Earth prefigured the strategic submarines of the Cold War, the American George Washington class, the Soviet Hotel class, all carrying missiles instead of planes, but sharing the same philosophy: invisibility as power. The I-400s were the prototype of that idea, the embryonic form of deterrence beneath the sea. Naval engineers still marvel at the audacity of their design. In technical journals, analyses of their twin-hull structure and global range appear beside studies of nuclear submarines. What once seemed a relic of obsession is now recognized as an evolutionary leap. Yet the I-400s also remain a caution. Brilliance cannot redeem a purpose born of despair. For Japan, the memory of these vessels occupies a space between pride and penitence. They symbolize a generation's capacity for sacrifice and creativity, yet also the blindness that led them into catastrophe. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where museums chronicle the consequences of that same war, the story of the I-400s is told not as a tale of lost might, but as an illustration of the nation's transformation from a builder of secret weapons to a builder of peace. Occasionally, filmmakers and writers return to the theme. In documentaries, the camera glides through computer reconstructions of the submarines, tracing the narrow corridors where crewmen once slept beside torpedoes. In novels and anime, the I-400s are reimagined as ghosts or time machines, symbols of forgotten ambition surfacing into a new age. Each retelling reshapes them, but the essence remains. They were ships that carried both flight and submersion, light and darkness. In the United States, their capture and destruction became a quiet footnote to victory, but among historians the fascination never waned. The declassified reports from 1946 reveal not only technical admiration, but an undercurrent of dread, a recognition that ingenuity knows no moral compass. One engineer wrote in his notes, "If we had thought of this first, we would have built it. If they had had time, they might have changed the balance of the oceans." The oceans, of course, do not keep balances. They erase them. And perhaps that is why the I-400s still compel attention. They embody the tension between what humans can create and what the world will allow to endure. Every few years, new expeditions descend to their resting places. Cameras capture the slow progress of corrosion, the way marine life claims each rivet, each plate. Coral branches sprout from the catapult rails. Anemones bloom in the hangar where planes once waited for dawn. Life, indifferent and unstoppable, turns the instruments of war into reefs. During one dive, a robotic arm brushed against the engraved number on the I-401's tower. The digits were still legible beneath the rust. For the scientists watching from the surface, it was as if the ship had spoken, not words, but the persistence of identity, a record of existence in a world that had moved on. For the descendants of the men who served aboard, the legacy is personal. Some gather each year on the shores near Kure, laying flowers upon the water. They remember fathers and brothers who returned silent from the sea, or who never returned at all. To them, the I-400s are not curiosities. They are fragments of family stories, proof that courage and futility can coexist in the same heartbeat. The more one studies these submarines, the more they resemble mirrors. In their creation we see the heights of imagination. In their destruction, the necessity of humility. They remind us that technological progress, detached from moral reflection, leads only downward, into pressure and darkness. Yet they also show that even in defeat, humanity's drive to create, to solve the impossible, endures. Today, satellites orbit where the Seirans might once have flown, and nuclear submarines glide silently through the same waters where the I-400 sank. The lineage is unbroken, the lesson eternal. The machines change, but the questions remain. How far will we go to outthink our enemies? What will we build when fear becomes inspiration? And who will remember decades later when the sea reclaims it all? On calm nights near the Goto Islands, fishermen say that their sonar sometimes catches strange echoes, long, smooth shapes that move slowly, then vanish. They joke that it is the spirit of the Sensuikan Tokugata, still patrolling its endless route beneath the moonlight. Perhaps they are right. The ocean keeps its ghosts close. If one could dive deep enough, past the shifting layers of temperature and light, one might find the I-400 resting exactly as it fell, a silhouette against the silt, a monument to the impossible. The hangar door remains sealed, the catapult silent, the command deck empty. Yet in that stillness there is something profoundly human, the trace of a dream that refused to die. The currents pass through the broken hull, whispering over the steel like breath through a flute. In those murmurs lives the story of ambition and surrender, of the fusion of air and water, of flight and drowning. The I-400s are not just relics. They are reminders that every civilization leaves its monuments in the deep, and that the sea, patient and eternal, remembers them all.